BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. So last year, we did an upload on the channel talking all about To Catch a Predator, Chris Hansen, and an individual named Lewis William Conrad Jr., who is more commonly known as Bill Conrad. And this is all about the To Catch a Predator incident in Murphy, Texas, which saw Bill Conrad taking his own life in a suicide. Now, on this channel, we used to do true crime Q&As about various subjects. Right now, they've been mostly only about the Zodiac Killer. Thank you to everybody who has been listening to those Zodiac Killer Q&As. But this one is kind of going in halfway because we had a comment coming into us on the To Catch a Predator response that we did from YouTube user Tyler Kozaboski, giving you a shout out. Good job editorializing, but it would have been nice to heard some more facts and a timeline, etc. of the case, though. And I think that that is an excellent point. So that's exactly what we're going to do right here. We are going to be talking about some of the events that led up to the suicide of Lewis William Conrad Jr., Bill Conrad. And I think that the best way to go about this would be for To Catch a Predator to tell the story in their own words, and then we can have somewhat of a discussion.
Law enforcement officers arrested over 500 sex offenders.
The Attorney General and the Lieutenant Governor both used cracking down on child sex predators as a central campaign issue. It's a felony in Texas to solicit a minor for sex over the internet, even if the suspect never leaves his house, never actually attempts to meet the minor. Murphy Police Chief William Myrick.
I guess that's what I like so much about the way the Texas law is written, is the fact that the meeting does not have to occur, so we can still make a case out of that.
That was the case when a decoy from Perverted Justice started getting messages from a man who we learned was an assistant district attorney from a nearby county. 56-year-old Lewis William Conrad Jr., screen name InExcess00, chatted graphically about sex with a Perverted Justice volunteer pretending to be a 13-year-old boy. And he sent pornographic pictures to the decoy. He talked about coming over to the undercover house, but in the end, never did. And as far as we know, never knew Dateline was in the area. The Murphy police obtained an arrest warrant for Conrad and did something we've not seen before. They contacted the local authorities in Conrad's town and knocked on his door. Conrad didn't answer, but police said there were signs he was still inside, so a tactical team was called in. The officers lined up in formation, then broke through the back door. But before they could make the arrest, the assistant DA pulled out a gun and pointed it at his head.
Okay, and that is once again from NBC Dateline, To Catch a Predator. And there's, to talk about the timeline here, I would say that To Catch a Predator really put a lot of things together. As I understand it, after going through some of the articles from Esquire magazine, the Houston Chronicle, and the Film Site Review, they had a lot to say about this one. And as I understand it, when they said they got a warrant, that actually happened at around 2:30 on the day of the day they approached his house. You heard them knocking on the door in the video clip there. But Dateline and To Catch a Predator and the film crews and Perverted Justice had all been on the scene earlier with the police department. And there is a bit of a big kind of, you could call it a conspiracy theory if you want, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, just that the police in Murphy, Texas were taking their orders from Chris Hansen, as well as other people of Perverted Justice, that they were participating in this to such a full extent that they were literally taking orders from NBC and from Perverted Justice. That's the group that works with the decoys. But they had the warrant at 2:30 in the afternoon. To Catch a Predator arrived at 8:30 in the morning. And I was trying to find the exact video clip that I heard this in, but I couldn't find the exact one. But one of these just sort of factoids they wanted to share about To Catch a Predator is, prior to the sting operations, what they like to do is they work through the night. So they were most likely just up all night previously. They arrived 8:30 at the residence in Murphy, Texas, where Bill Conrad was living. And then they were waiting for the judge to issue the warrant. And then once they had the warrant, then they were able to perform this operation where they were trying to arrest Bill Conrad. But of course, that was unsuccessful because he pulled out a firearm. And as you heard there, he pointed it at his head. There's another question that is written here in this comment after the first part that we read. And is there ever any evidence that Conrad ever made any attempt to actually come into physical contact with a minor? Now, I mean, I don't know about never, but what I can say is it doesn't really appear to be too relevant to this discussion because you heard very clearly what they were saying. The crime that they were charging him with was, number one, the solicitation. And one thing that I did learn from reading this, I think this was in Esquire, they were saying that he was actually pretending to be a 19-year-old male online. Like, he was lying about his age. He wasn't saying that he was in his 50s. He was saying that he was 19 years old when he was talking to the decoy, and the decoy's name was Luke. And I believe the person working for Perverted Justice was named PJ, and just said that people seemed to respond very well to the decoy named Luke. I'm not really sure why. But yes, Conrad was pretending to be 19, and he was talking to a 13-year-old. However, though, you heard very clearly in that clip that was played by NBC that it's not about the physical act. In the state of Texas, that's an irrelevant question, more or less, because the thing that they were trying to get him for was the solicitation, was talking about going to the house to meet up with this underage person for sex. That's the first thing. And the second thing that you also heard there was he sent pornographic images to a minor, someone whom he believed was 13 years old at the time. So that's the other big thing that we should point out. And that instantly just becomes some type of a child pornography charge and a sex offender charge in itself, sending photos of his genitalia to a 13-year-old. So it's not so much about the physical acts. And you see this all the time on To Catch a Predator. I mean, I used to watch this show very frequently, and they would have people who would drive up to the house. They would just kind of look around, and I really don't like bringing in the Mad TV parody of this, but somebody said, "Oh, I'm so excited to see you. I'm going to go walk in the other room." Like, they just thought it was really weird about how someone is not coming out to meet them, or they just get the very synthetic vibes that are coming when they're talking about the show, where they can tell that it's something that is staged, so they don't enter the house, but of course they still get arrested. However, in the state of Texas, they don't even have to arrive at the house. They can just sending the electronic content is enough to get them arrested. So that's really what was going on with Lewis William Conrad Jr. there. And I would actually like to go on to a different article that comes to us from Film Daily. And this is the horrible tale of a To Catch a Predator suicide that is talking all about the death of Bill Conrad. The show could sometimes get dicey, particularly when the Predator was caught red-handed by Chris Hansen and his team of cameras. Yet there were worse outcomes than the heated arguments. And in some episodes, arguably the most tragic ending of all was the death of Lewis William Conrad Jr., a.k.a. Bill. Bill Conrad was an assistant district attorney living in Terrell, Texas. In 2006, the online watchdog group Perverted Justice, a group used by the show to identify potential online predators, began an investigation into Conrad's online dealings. Conrad allegedly solicited sex from a watchdog decoy posing as a 13-year-old. Once again, that's the decoy we mentioned who was using the name Luke. As per the process on To Catch a Predator, Conrad was given the address of a sting house where the police said that the boy would be at. And then, he obviously did not attend to that. And one of the things, though, that we should note is that his, when the police came by his house, we said the police on To Catch a Predator arrived at 8:30 a.m. that day, and they didn't see any movement at all that Conrad was in the house, but they were patrolling the area, and at some point they noticed that there had been a Sunday morning paper that was on the doorstep, and when they went to one side of the house, and then they went back to the other side of the house, and they saw that the Sunday morning paper had been removed. Therefore, they knew that it was most likely that Bill Conrad was still in the house. So that's why they continued with their own operation. And very clearly, though, they were doing something that went along with the law. And we talked about this in our previous segment that we did on this incident here in Murphy, Texas. And I said that it's a far-out theory to think that Chris Hansen, of all people, would be masterminding a police unit in Murphy, Texas. But thanks to the YouTube channel Danknet, who provided the videography that you can see yourself one more time, Danknet, D-A-N-K, Danknet, they showed that that appears to be completely true. It's not only Chris Hansen, but also members of Perverted Justice are directing the police on what to do. And one of the reasons why this became so controversial is because they're saying that the cameras and the TV show was something that prompted prompted Bill Conrad to take his own life. But the response from NBC, which was something that I agreed with, and I just said flat out very clearly, I agreed with them when they said that the only reason why this man committed suicide is because he was ashamed of what he did. He knew he had done something wrong, and he knew that he was guilty. However, I was since reading on a different forum, people are just talking about this, and while Bill Conrad is not here to defend himself anymore and give his side of the story, what they were postulating was that it wasn't even the sex charge that Bill Conrad was really bothered about. They're saying that he didn't want to be outed as a homosexual, that was the issue that was actually holding him up. And when I was looking into some things about this particular case, I encountered a blog that talked about suicides and deaths, and it was like a purely just archived piece of information about all of the suicides and deaths that have been recorded. And we're going to have a look at that right there. November 6th, 2006, in Texas. The former Kaufman County District Attorney committed suicide Sunday when police tried to arrest him at his Terrell home on a warrant tied to a child predator sting. Murphy Police Sergeant Snow Robertson said that Lewis, also known as Bill Conrad Jr., solicited sex from a decoy posing online as a 13-year-old boy. And once again, in Texas, they have every right to do that. Murphy Mayor Brett Baldwin said that the sting was a joint operation between Perverted Justice and NBC's Dateline show To Catch a Predator that lured men seeking sex with children to Murphy. Perverted Justice is an internet watchdog group that received national attention after helping Dateline catch dozens of men trolling chat rooms to meet children for sex. NBC officials said in a statement that there was no contact between Mr. Conrad and Dateline. Well, I can't imagine that there would be. A crew was outside on the street when Mr. Conrad shot himself. Perverted Justice officials did not respond to emails seeking comment. Sergeant Robertson said there was nothing that the police could have done to prevent Mr. Conrad, age 56, from shooting himself in the head. No one else was in the house. And I believe that that's exactly the way that someone described this in the episode of To Catch a Predator, simply saying that he pointed the gun at his head when the police were entering the house and said that the law enforcement officers would not get hurt, and he fired the trigger. And another question that came to us on YouTube about this was that, we asked the first one, is there ever any evidence that Conrad actually made an attempt to come into physical contact with a minor? And the second thing to say is more of a comment rather than a question. He was targeted by the show due to his status, once again referring to him as the ADA, the Assistant District Attorney. He engaged in some real weak phone sex with an adult pretending to be a kid, and then was on the verge of being publicly outed, and for a variety of things, not only interacting with an underage person, but also being outed as a homosexual. And then the actions of To Catch a Predator and Dateline perhaps could have escalated the situation, and it's Perhaps it is true that they did escalate the situation. However, by no means would they genuinely be responsible because, once again, the police were trying to arrest this individual because he had broken the law. He was a high-profile member of the county. The assistant district attorney. He would have been on camera at some point. And it's really hard to say that NBC would be directly responsible for something like that. And more importantly, the guy was doing things that were very heinous, that were not only illegal, but also very immoral. Talking about engaging in sex acts with 13-year-olds, sending photos of his genitalia. He deserved to be arrested. And the way that they could have gone about this was, a matter of their own choice. They chose to go about it this way, and they didn't put the gun in his hand and tell him to commit suicide, now did they? Doesn't sound like it. What this is rather is a case of someone who was ashamed of what they had done. They didn't want to face the music, and it's also possible that there is something about how he didn't want to be publicly identified as a homosexual, but once again, To Catch a Predator, Dateline would still not be responsible for that all the same. And I would actually like to go back to Film Daily because they talk about some things here involving the aftermath of what happened after Lewis Conrad's suicide. And the aftermath of the controversial incident was a mess of legal issues for To Catch a Predator and Dateline NBC. Conrad's sister, Patricia Conrad, brought a $105 million lawsuit against NBC. Patricia claimed that Dateline was directly responsible for her brother's death by hijacking police procedure. I really have to tell you about that theory that we were talking about. I thought that it was absolutely crazy to think that Chris Hansen even had that type of power to start, influencing the police department in that way. And you can see the videography for yourself online. Like I said, recommending the channel DankNet and their video on Chris Hansen. You can see that is what happened, though. He was directing the police department. If they want to talk about hijacking police procedure, that could be something. And if the lawyers want to play it out like that, I do think they might have something to say about that. But overall, I would still say that the primary motivation for Louis Conrad's suicide was simply that he was ashamed of what he had done, and he knew that he was going to feel the wrath and feel the consequences of his actions. Patricia Conrad accused the police of failing to protect her brother and placing To Catch a Predator's interests of higher ratings before their duties as law enforcement. NBC denied that it had any involvement in the decision to make the arrest, and the police were merely acting on a tip supplied from the watchdog group. Well, as we said, we do know that To Catch a Predator was involved with the police operations. However, as far as this line here about higher ratings, yes, of course they want high ratings. They are a TV show. There's no hiding that. Very clearly, that's what they want people to do. They want people to watch the show. But did they ever encourage Louis Conrad in any way to commit suicide? Absolutely not. And, I do admit, though, that Dateline did have a big role in choosing the police procedures. Dateline's cameras were present at the scene when Conrad shot himself, their audio picking up the sound of the gunshot, and I think that that's very important to note because they do not have any video of Conrad pulling the trigger or anything like that, or any interactions. It is the audio picking up the sound of the gunshot. The footage was aired as part of a To Catch a Predator episode, but later stripped from Dateline's website. In 2008, Patricia Conrad settled out of court, although the details of the settlement remain unknown. And once again, that big thank you to Film Daily for their article on the death of Bill Conrad. If you look into this case, you will see that there is an article from Esquire magazine that talks about this. Most of the Wikipedia seems to be quoting the Esquire magazine and article. And with Esquire magazine, they were really trying to show that they're trying to put the blame on To Catch a Predator or Chris Hansen, NBC. And one of the things that they point to with this is simply by saying that a lot of the things you heard in that Dateline segment were jumbled or they were perhaps misrepresented. And, the timeline sounds a little bit fuzzy. But I don't necessarily know how valuable it would have been for them to say that they arrived at 8:30, they got the warrant at around 2:30, and and things of that nature. But what they do want to say here is that it actually could have been much longer before the Murphy sting operation when Bill Conrad, was talking to the decoy. We're talking about months. According to the Esquire magazine article, his social media, his MySpace, we're dealing with 2006, I guess that was a thing back then, people using MySpace, and his MySpace account had been inactive for months prior. And we said this was something that was misrepresenting himself as a 19-year-old. It had been inactive for months, and that these incidents actually happened much earlier on. Hey, sometimes things happen that way. And yes, of course, the show escalated things. But once again, does that erase the wrongdoing that Bill Conrad did? I don't think so. Does that erase the fact that he tried to solicit sex from a 13-year-old? Does that erase the fact that he thought he was sending pictures of his genitalia to a 13-year-old? Absolutely not. It's like he did something that was illegal and immoral and unethical, and this is a case of someone who didn't want to face the reality of his wrongdoings. And just to conclude here, I would like to just read one last thing from the article in Esquire. Like I said, if you do try to look anything about this, they say that Bill Conrad was a good prosecutor. All of the judges and lawyers who knew him best, even the ones who served on the opposite side of the aisle from him, the men and women who defended their clients against him, say that he was very good at his job. He had a near photographic memory for the law, and they say, this made him either a formidable opponent or a vulnerable ally, depending on where you stood. So Conrad, no doubt, knew the statute in the Texas Penal Code description of the crime of online solicitation of a minor that states that if an adult offends when he communicates in a sexually explicit manner with a minor and defines minor as anyone who represents him or herself as being under the age of 17, they are breaking the law. So I guess that's where we're going to have to leave it at that for now. And the Esquire magazine article is not very friendly to Catch a Predator, but they even brought up that very big point. He was a lawyer, and he should have known better, and he knew that he was breaking the law, and he didn't want to face the consequences. Therefore, you have someone who was ashamed of what they had done and dealing with their own guilt. All right, well, that's all for me now. Please drop anything you want in the comment section below, and I'd love to hear from you. And until next time.